In November 2001, the border city of El Paso, Texas, was preparing for the holiday season. Families were shopping, kids were laughing, and 5-year-old Alexandra Flores was one of them. A bright, happy little girl, the youngest of 8 children, out with her family buying Christmas presents. But that night, as her parents loaded their shopping cart, Alexandra wandered just a few steps away and into the path of a man who would change everything. What happened next would horrify an entire community. Captured on Walmart surveillance cameras, Alexandra was seen walking out of the store with a stranger, a man who moments later would abduct her, murder her, and try to burn her body to hide the evidence. The next morning, her tiny body was discovered naked and burned in an alley 18 miles away. She had been strangled to death, and the plastic bag placed over her head still bore her killer's palm print. The man responsible was David Santiago Renteria, a registered sex offender already on probation for molesting child. A man who showed no mercy to a 5-year-old girl. Over the next 2 decades, Renteria would fight for his life through endless appeals, claiming gang members forced him to take part in the crime, a story the courts never believed. And in November 2023, after 22 years on death row, Texas carried out his execution. Before his death, Renteria was given his final meal, a simple serving of beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, and sweet tea. And when asked for his final words, he said, "I'm sorry for all the wrongs I have done. To the victims of the family, there is not a day that goes by that I do not think about that fateful event." He was pronounced dead at 7:11 p.m. inside the Huntsville unit. To understand how an innocent child's shopping trip turned into one of Texas's most heartbreaking crimes, and how a convicted child killer met his fate more than 2 decades later, we have to go back to where it all began. But first, hit subscribe and tap the notification bell, because this isn't just a story about justice. It's about innocence lost, evil unmasked, and a long road to reckoning. Born on September 14th, 1996, in the border city of El Paso, Texas, Alexandra Flores was the youngest of 8 children, a joyful, curious, and affectionate little girl whose laughter filled her family's modest home. Her parents described her as a child with a heart far bigger than her tiny frame, always eager to help her mother in the kitchen or follow her older siblings around the neighborhood. She loved cartoons, coloring books, and Christmas lights, her favorite time of year. By November 2001, the Flores family was busy preparing for the holiday season. Like many families in El Paso, they made a trip to Walmart, where Alexandra's older sisters helped pick out decorations and gifts. It was a typical Saturday evening. Families rushing through aisles, children pointing at toys, Christmas music playing softly over the store speakers. Nothing about that night suggested tragedy. Nothing warned them that this would be the last shopping trip they'd ever take together. At around 5 p.m. on November 18, 2001, while her parents were distracted with shopping, Alexandra wandered a few steps ahead. She was just a few feet away, still within sight, innocent and unsuspecting. But those few seconds were enough for a predator to find her. According to court records and surveillance footage later reviewed by investigators, Alexandra was approached by a man, calm, deliberate, pretending to help her. Moments later, cameras captured the two of them walking out of the store's front doors together. Alexandra, barely tall enough to reach the man's waist, followed without fear. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. It was around 5:15 p.m. when the Walmart surveillance cameras recorded the moment that would haunt El Paso forever. The man, later identified as David Santiago Renteria, followed Alexandra for nearly 40 minutes inside the store, through aisles of Christmas ornaments, toys, and decorations, carefully watching, waiting for a moment when no one was looking. And when that moment came, he took her hand and calmly led her out the doors, disappearing into the night. For hours, Alexandra's family searched frantically throughout the store and parking lot. Her name echoed through the aisles, panic rising with every unanswered call. Police were notified, and an Amber Alert was issued. But by then, it was too late. The next morning, on November 19, 2001, a passerby made a horrifying discovery in an alleyway behind a church. roughly 16 to 18 miles from the Walmart. Lying near a dumpster was the body of a small child, naked, partially burned, and almost unrecognizable. Investigators would later confirm it was Alexandra Flores. The medical examiner's report painted a chilling picture. Alexandra had suffered 2 blunt force blows to her skull before being manually strangled to death. The burns covering her body were inflicted after she had already died. A plastic grocery bag had been placed over her head, later found to bear the palm print of her killer. The sight broke seasoned investigators. Officers who had seen years of violence described the scene as one of the most disturbing they had ever encountered, a place of unspeakable cruelty where innocents had been completely destroyed. As news spread, shockwaves rippled through El Paso. Parents clutched their children tighter. Churches held vigils. Strangers left flowers and stuffed animals near the site where her body was found. The Flores family, torn apart by grief, struggled to comprehend how a simple Christmas shopping trip had ended in horror. The murder of Alexandra Flores wasn't just another crime. It was a moment that shattered a community's sense of safety. And as detectives began piecing together clues from surveillance footage, fingerprints, and DNA, one name soon rose to the surface, a man who had already been given a second chance by the justice system. His name was David Santiago Renteria. Born on November 22, 1969, in the El Paso, Texas area, David Santiago Renteria grew up in a working-class neighborhood where family, faith, and routine shaped his early years. Those who knew him in his youth described him as a quiet, polite boy, a good kid from a church-going family who, by all appearances, had a promising future. Teachers recalled he was respectful, and relatives said he loved playing football in the dusty lots near his home. But as the years went on, something dark began to surface. By his early 20s, Renteria's life had started to unravel. In 1992, he was convicted of indecency with a child after a young girl, only 7 years old, bravely testified that he had molested her. The case devastated the small community that once saw him as a friend and neighbor. For that crime, Renteria served his sentence and was released under probationary supervision, required to register as a sex offender and adhere to strict behavioral conditions. But compliance did not mean redemption. Despite outward appearances of stability, holding a steady job, living quietly in El Paso, occasionally attending church, court records later revealed that Renteria remained a man haunted by impulses he could not or would not control. At the time of Alexandra Flores' murder in 2001, he was still on probation for that earlier offense, a free man who, legally, should have been under close watch. Yet, he moved about freely, blending into daily life. His criminal record, though damning, did little to alert those around him to the danger he posed. Those who once remembered the good kid from El Paso now saw the darker truth. David Renteria had been given a second chance, and he used it to destroy another child's life. When Alexandra Flores was abducted and killed, David Renteria was still on probation, living in El Paso and under the state's supervision. His arrest sent shockwaves through law enforcement. A convicted child molester, already on the sex offender registry, accused once again of harming a child. But this time, the result was far more horrific. During his trial, Renteria's defense painted a picture of fear and coercion. They claimed that he had fallen under the control of members of the violent prison gang Barrio Azteca, specifically a figure known by the street name Flaco. According to Renteria, these men allegedly forced him to lure Alexandra from the Walmart, threatening to harm his family if he refused. He insisted he was coerced into helping dispose of her body, claiming the burns and other details were orchestrated by the gang to send a message. The defense argued that Renteria was not a monster by choice, but a man trapped in a web of intimidation and violence, someone too afraid to resist orders from those more dangerous than himself. But prosecutors told a very different story. They argued the evidence was undeniable, and it all pointed to one man acting alone. Renteria's palm print was found on the plastic bag that had been placed over Alexandra's head. Blood evidence recovered from the interior of his van matched Alexandra's DNA, and the Walmart surveillance footage unmistakably captured him following and leaving the store with her. There is no sign of other suspects, no trace of the alleged gang involvement, and no evidence of coercion. To the state, Renteria's gang story was nothing more than a desperate attempt to deflect blame, a manipulative narrative spun by a seasoned offender who knew exactly what he was doing. And so the central question loomed over the courtroom. Was David Renteria a coerced accomplice, acting under threat from powerful criminals, or was he the cold, calculating predator who alone planned and executed the abduction and murder of a 5-year-old girl? It was a question that would divide opinion, test the limits of compassion and justice, and ultimately determine whether he would live or die by the state's hand. It was the evening of November 18, 2001, when 5-year-old Alexandra Flores entered a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, with her family. They were there to pick up Christmas gifts, a normal Sunday for a large family preparing for the holidays. Alexandra was the youngest of 8, cheerful and curious, darting between aisles as her parents browsed. Surveillance footage later captured every chilling step of her final moments. The video showed a man, later identified as David Santiago Renteria, wearing a dark t-shirt, dark shorts, and a baseball cap, wandering the aisles just feet away from the Flores family. At approximately 5:15 p.m., Alexandra was seen walking toward the store's exit. Seconds later, Renteria appeared behind her. Together, they disappeared through the sliding glass doors and into the cold November dusk. She was never seen alive again. Later that evening, Renteria was spotted at a nearby Sam's Club, where he purchased a bag of oranges. When Alexandra's autopsy was later performed, traces of partially digested orange wedges were discovered in her stomach, a small, haunting detail that placed her directly with her killer after the abduction. By the next morning, the horror became real. A passerby discovered the naked, partially burned body of a child in an alley roughly 16 to 18 miles from the Walmart. The discovery sent shockwaves through El Paso. A city already on edge would soon find itself in the grip of terror and grief. The autopsy of Alexandra Flores painted a picture of unimaginable cruelty. Her small body was found nude, with a plastic grocery bag tightly covering her head. She had sustained 2 distinct blunt force injuries to each side of her skull, violent blows that caused significant bruising. The cause of death, the medical examiner confirmed, was asphyxia due to manual strangulation. Her burns were consistent with being set on fire post-mortem, an apparent attempt to destroy evidence and hinder identification. Yet, even in death, Alexandra's body told the truth her voice could not. When detectives searched David Renteria's van, they made discoveries that shattered any doubt. Bloodstains found inside matched Alexandra's DNA, confirming she had been in the vehicle. Forensic technicians also recovered a plastic bag similar to the one found over her head, and on it, investigators lifted a palm print that matched Renteria's right hand. Combined with the Walmart surveillance footage, the orange fragments from her stomach, and the DNA evidence, the state's case became devastatingly clear. Every trail, every physical trace, pointed back to one man. After 2 tense weeks of around-the-clock investigation, detectives closed in on their suspect. On December 3, 2001, David Santiago Renteria was arrested and taken into custody. During interrogation, he gave a custodial statement admitting to certain details of the crime, though he shifted blame, claiming others were involved. His words, however, failed to align with the overwhelming forensic evidence stacked against him. Shortly thereafter, Renteria was formally indicted for capital murder, a charge reserved for the most serious of crimes, because Alexandra was under 6 years old. The case would soon become one of El Paso's most high-profile child murder prosecutions in decades. As news of the arrest broke, the El Paso community was consumed by grief and anger. Parents clutched their children tighter. Vigils were held outside the Walmart where Alexandra was last seen. Local media coverage was relentless, flashing her smiling school photos alongside mugshots of Renteria. The once quiet border town found itself transformed, its people demanding justice, its police force under immense pressure, and its sense of safety forever shattered. The horror of what happened to Alexandra Flores was no longer just a crime story. It was a wound in the heart of Texas, and every citizen of El Paso felt its pain. Nearly 2 years after Alexandra Flores' murder, the case of Texas v. David Santiago Renteria went before jury. It was September 2003, and El Paso residents filled the courtroom to capacity. The prosecution laid out a harrowing sequence of evidence, from the Walmart footage to the DNA found in Renteria's van, arguing that this was a deliberate, calculated act by a man with a known history of preying on children. After hearing weeks of testimony, the jury returned a verdict of guilty for capital murder, finding that Renteria had intentionally kidnapped, murdered, and attempted to destroy the body of a child under 6. The jurors also determined that Renteria posed a continuing threat to society, citing his prior conviction for indecency with a child and the brutality of Alexandra's killing. The prosecution emphasized the pattern: a repeat offender, unrehabilitated, and dangerous. The defense countered with pleas for mercy, introducing mitigation evidence, accounts from Renteria's family and school teachers who described him as once a good student, a quiet boy who endured violence and instability in his childhood home. They painted him as a man broken by his past, capable of redemption if given life without parole. But the jury was unmoved. The images of Alexandra's final moments, the cold precision of the evidence, and Renteria's criminal history were too heavy to overlook. On September 16, 2003, David Santiago Renteria was sentenced to death. The courtroom fell silent as the judge read the sentence aloud. For Alexandra's family, it was justice, a verdict that couldn't bring their daughter back, but could ensure the man who took her life would never harm another child again. After his conviction, Renteria's case entered the long and winding path of appeals that often defines death penalty litigation in Texas. In 2006, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, CCA, reversed the punishment phase of his trial, ruling that certain procedural errors required a new sentencing hearing. But in the retrial that followed, the outcome remained unchanged. Once again, the jury sentenced Renteria to death, reaffirming their belief that his crime met the highest threshold of severity. From there, Renteria's attorneys launched a series of appeals that spanned nearly 2 decades. They raised claims that prosecutors withheld exculpatory evidence, that jurors were unfairly influenced, and that Renteria's gang coercion story, the claim that he had been forced by members of the Barrio Azteca to commit the crime, had not been fully considered. In 2011, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals again reviewed his case and upheld the death sentence, rejecting all defense arguments as unfounded. Renteria's legal team then turned to the federal courts, filing multiple habeas corpus petitions, arguing violations of due process and ineffective assistance of counsel. Each one was meticulously reviewed, and each one was denied. By the 2020s, his last hope rested in emergency stay requests to higher courts, including the United States Supreme Court, which ultimately declined to intervene. As the years passed, execution dates were set and delayed, but the outcome never changed. Each appeal brought renewed attention from the media and sorrow from Alexandra's family, who had waited more than 2 decades to see justice completed. When the final stay was denied and his execution date confirmed, the long arc of the legal battle finally came to an end. In the eyes of the state of Texas, David Santiago Renteria's guilt was absolute, the evidence overwhelming, the crime unforgivable, and the punishment just. But for those who followed the case, it remained a chilling reminder of how evil can hide behind an ordinary face, and how the road from conviction to execution can stretch across generations. After more than 2 decades of appeals, delays, and court reviews, the final chapter in the story of David Santiago Renteria came on the evening of November 16, 2023, inside the Huntsville unit in Huntsville, Texas, the state's oldest and most infamous execution facility. Nearly 22 years had passed since the murder of 5-year-old Alexandra Flores. 22 long years of courtroom battles, legal motions, and quiet waiting for a justice that seemed endlessly postponed. Outside the prison, a small group gathered in silence, their breath visible in the cold air as officers led Renteria into the death chamber. At 7 p.m. Central Standard Time, Renteria was strapped to the gurney, his arms extended under the stark fluorescent light. Witnesses, including members of Alexandra's family, were seated behind a glass window, separated from him by inches and eternity. The warden asked if he had any final words. At 7 p.m., a lethal dose of pentobarbital began to flow through the 4 lines. The color drained from his face almost immediately, and his breathing slowed. 11 minutes later, at 7:11 p.m., David Santiago Renteria was pronounced dead. As the curtains closed, the room fell silent. For the Flores family, justice, delayed for more than 2 decades, had finally been carried out. For others watching, it was the end of a story that had haunted El Paso for nearly a generation. Moments before the lethal injection began, Renteria spoke his final words, soft, deliberate, and filled with the weight of 22 years of reflection. "I'm sorry for all the wrongs I have done," he said, his voice calm. "And for those who have called for my death, who are about to murder me, I forgive you." He paused briefly, his eyes shifting toward the window where Alexandra's relatives sat in quiet grief. Then he continued, "To the victims of the family, there's not a day that goes by that I do not think about that fateful event of that day and what transpired." He ended with a faint sigh, whispering a prayer under his breath as the sedative took hold. Within minutes, his chest rose for the last time. The witnesses described the moment as both heavy and surreal, the culmination of years of sorrow and the haunting realization that even with his death, the pain of Alexandra's loss would never truly fade. Some of her relatives wept quietly. Others simply bowed their heads, the enormity of the moment pressing down like the air itself had thickened with grief. Outside the prison walls, the crowd dispersed slowly into the dark Texas night. The state had executed its judgment, and the file on David Santiago Renteria was officially closed. But for El Paso, and especially for the Flores family, November 16, 2023, would forever be remembered as the day justice finally came full circle. Because on that night, as the clock struck 7:11 p.m., a story that began with the abduction of a little girl in a Walmart aisle came to its grim and final end. Not with anger, but with the quiet, devastating sound of closure. What do you think? After 22 years, did justice finally prevail for little Alexandra Flores? Was David Santiago Renteria's execution the closure her family deserved, or just another reminder of how long justice can take? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe to the channel. Because here on Crime Report Network, we bring you the true stories behind the headlines. Stories of crime, consequence, and the search for justice. Crime Report Network. Every story deserves to be heard. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and never forget the victims.